My husband called and said, I inherited millions. Pack your things and get out. When I got home, the divorce papers were waiting. I read them, signed without hesitation, set the pen down, and smiled. You'll need all the luck you can get. The call came at 2:14 p.m. on a Thursday. I was elbow deep in a grant proposal for the literacy nonprofit I'd been running for 6 years. The kind of work that doesn't pay well and doesn't impress anyone at dinner parties, and that I did anyway because I believed in it. My phone buzzed on the desk. Thomas. I picked up on the second ring because I always picked up for Thomas. I inherited millions, he said, just like that. No greeting, no build-up. His voice was the voice he used in meetings, measured, declarative, slightly above the room. Pack your things and get out. I sat very still for a moment. Outside my office window, 2 kids were chasing a dog across the park. The dog was winning. Thomas, I said, the house is mine, always has been. You know that. A pause, not an emotional one, a logistical one, like he was consulting a list. I'll have someone collect the rest of your things by Friday if you're not done by then. The line went dead. I set my phone face down on the desk. I finished the paragraph I'd been writing. Then I saved the document, closed my laptop, and drove home. My name is Nora Callahan Briggs. I'm 41 years old. For 11 years, I was Thomas Briggs's wife, and I had been waiting for this moment for exactly 94 days. Let me back up. I met Thomas at a fundraising gala. His company was one of our donors, which in retrospect tells you something about the power dynamic we started with and never quite escaped. He was handsome in the way of men who have always known they were handsome, confident, funny in a sharp, controlled way that could pivot to cutting if the room shifted wrong. I thought it was intelligence. It took me years to understand the difference. We married after 2 years of dating. I kept my career, nonprofit work, community development, a small organization called Read Forward that I'd helped build from a 3-person operation to a staff of 22 and an annual budget of $1.4 million. Thomas worked in commercial real estate. He made real money. He was quietly, persistently dismissive of what I did. Not cruelly at first, the way you're dismissive of a hobby that's gotten out of hand. It's good that you have your project, he used to say. My project. The red flags were always there. I rationalized them the way you do when you're inside something. When the thing you're rationalizing is also the thing that makes up your entire daily life, and you are not, frankly, ready to blow it up. He controlled the finances. I had an account for personal expenses, a generous one, and I told myself that was normal. Lots of couples operated that way. He made decisions about the house unilaterally and framed it as taking things off my plate. He had opinions about my friends, delivered as observations, and slowly I found myself seeing those friends less because it was easier than navigating his observations. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself we were fine. Then, 14 months ago, I noticed the phone. It started small. He'd always been private about his phone. That was normal. He was in business. There were deals that required discretion. But there's a difference between professional privacy and the particular kind of alertness that comes over someone when their phone is near and another person enters the room. I noticed the angle shift, the screen dark, the way he'd step out to take calls he used to take in front of me. I told myself it was nothing. Then I found the hotel receipt. It wasn't dramatic. No lipstick, no perfume. Just a receipt from a Marriott in Columbus, Ohio, from a weekend Thomas had told me he spent in Chicago at a conference. I found it in his jacket pocket while I was organizing for the dry cleaner. The name on the receipt was his. The dates were the dates he'd been gone. The conference in Chicago had been real. I checked. His assistant confirmed he'd attended Thursday to Saturday. He'd been back by Sunday afternoon. The hotel receipt was for Monday and Tuesday, 2 extra days, in a different city, charged to a card I didn't recognize. My hands were very steady when I put the receipt back in his pocket. That frightened me more than the shaking would have. I didn't say anything, not because I was afraid, or not only that, because something had shifted in the back of my mind. A quiet voice that said, wait, look first. Understand what you're actually dealing with before you move. So I waited, and I looked. The woman's name was Kara Sutton. I found this out not through any dramatic investigation, but through the patient, boring work of paying attention. A name that appeared in his calendar, lunch with CS, more frequently than client lunches typically appear. A florist charge on a credit card statement I happened to see. The particular quality of his distraction on certain evenings, present but elsewhere, like a radio tuned to a frequency I couldn't hear. I did not confront him. Instead, I made an appointment with an attorney. Her name was Margaret Dyson, family law, 23 years of practice, with the specific, unsentimental clarity of a woman who has sat across from thousands of people in the worst moments of their lives and has learned to help them think anyway. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and I remember looking out her window at the city while she reviewed the information I'd brought her and thinking, I built a life here. I built something real. Tell me everything, she said. I did. She listened without expression. When I finished, she set down her pen and folded her hands. You're being careful, she said. I'm trying to be. Good. She paused. I need you to continue being careful. Don't confront him. Don't move money. Don't give him any indication that you're preparing for anything. Can you do that? Yes, I said. There's something else, Margaret said carefully. You mentioned his father passed away recently. 8 months ago. Heart attack. And the estate? I don't know the details. Thomas handled it. He said it was complicated. She looked at me steadily. I'd like to have a forensic accountant review whatever financial disclosures we can access before he makes any moves. I nodded. In the meantime, she said, document everything. I went home and started documenting everything. The forensic accountant's name was Robert Colley, CPA, certified fraud examiner examiner, 15 years doing exactly the kind of work where someone needs to know where money went and why the story doesn't add up. Margaret referred him to me. He was quiet, methodical, and had the specific patience of a man who understood that financial fraud is rarely theatrical. It's mostly just paperwork if you know where to look. He found the offshore account in 11 days. Not a massive sum by the standards of Thomas's business. $340,000 moved in 3 transfers over the past 14 months to an account in the Cayman Islands registered to a holding company with a name that meant nothing. LCH Investments, LLC. This isn't unusual for commercial real estate, Robert told me over the phone. He had a careful, neutral voice that I appreciated. But the timing is... The timing? The first transfer was made 6 days after his father's estate was opened for probate. I sat with that for a moment. His father left him money. A significant amount, based on what I've been able to pull from public records. The estate is still in process. There are assets being liquidated, but the preliminary valuations suggest we're talking about something in the range of $2 to $3 million. I stared at the wall. He's moving it, I said. It appears so. Before the divorce, he may be planning. He was planning this before I even knew it was happening. That's what the timeline suggests. I thanked him and ended the call and sat in my car in the parking garage outside my office for about 6 minutes, just breathing, not crying. I wasn't at the crying stage yet. I was at the other stage, the one that feels like cold water, the one where everything becomes very clear and very still and you understand precisely what you're dealing with. Thomas had been planning to leave me. He had a woman. He had money he was hiding. And he had been moving pieces into position for over a year while I brought him coffee in the morning and asked about his day, and went to bed next to him every night believing that the distance between us was something that could be closed. I called Margaret. We need to move faster, I said. I know, she said. I've been watching the estate filings. He's about to receive a large disbursement. How large? Final accounting isn't complete, but Robert's preliminary estimate is $2.1 million net of taxes. I almost laughed. I pressed my lips together instead. He's going to use the inheritance as the exit, I said. He gets the money, he's financially independent, and then he pulls the trigger. That's my read as well. What do we do? Margaret was quiet for a moment. We let him. She explained it to me over the next 30 minutes. In the state we lived in, marital assets were subject to equitable distribution. The key word was marital. Assets acquired before the marriage or received as inheritance were generally considered separate property. If Thomas received his inheritance cleanly as his own separate asset, I had no claim to it. Unless the inheritance had been anticipated partially during the marriage, in which case some portions might be considered marital. Unless assets had been commingled. Unless he had transferred marital funds to offshore accounts in anticipation of divorce, which is called dissipation and is very much the kind of thing courts take seriously. He's been moving money, I said. Exactly. And if we can document the dissipation of marital assets, which Robert has already largely done, the court has a basis to compensate you from other marital property. The house, his business interest, 12 years of marital contributions. I thought about the word contributions. 11 years of hosting his clients for dinners I cooked, of adjusting my schedule around his travel, of turning down a position with a national nonprofit organization 3 years ago because the role required relocation and Thomas didn't want to move. My project. There's something else, Margaret said. I spoke with a colleague who specializes in financial fraud, Diane Voss. She's done expert testimony in 3 divorce cases involving hidden assets. I'd like her to review Robert's findings before we go to mediation. Yes, I said. Whatever you need. Nora, she paused. This is going to be uncomfortable. He's going to be angry. He's going to feel ambushed. Good, I said. She was quiet for a beat. Then, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile in her voice. Yes, I suppose that's the point. The call came 94 days after I first walked into Margaret's office. 2:14 p.m. on a Thursday. I inherited millions. Pack your things and get out. I drove home. The divorce papers were on the kitchen table, neatly stacked, tabbed in 3 colors, with small adhesive arrows pointing to the signature lines. His lawyer had done meticulous work. I appreciated the craftsmanship even as I understood what it meant. Thomas was not home. He'd done this by phone, which told me everything I needed to know about how he expected this to go. He expected it to be easy. He expected me to be the woman he'd spent 11 years making smaller, the woman with her project and her generous personal account and her quiet adjustments. I sat down at the kitchen table. I read every page, all 43 of them. I made notes in the margins. Margaret had prepared me for what to look for. Then I picked up the pen. I signed every page, every line. I set the pen down. I looked at the stack of papers. Then I texted Margaret. He served me. I've signed. See you at mediation. Her response came 30 seconds later. Good. Robert and Diane will be ready. See you Tuesday. I got up. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen counter, my kitchen counter, the one I'd picked out and installed and refinished twice, and I drank it slowly. When Thomas came home at 6:40, I was reading on the couch. He stopped when he saw me. I expected you to be gone, he said. I'm leaving tomorrow. I turned a page. I wanted to make sure I had everything. He looked at the signed papers on the table. Something shifted in his face. Not relief, exactly. The relaxation of someone who expected a fight and has just discovered they're not getting one. Nora, he said in a different voice. The voice from before. The warm one. This doesn't have to be. Thomas. I looked up at him. You'll need all the luck you can get. He frowned. What does that mean? I smiled. See you Tuesday. The mediation suite was on the 9th floor of a building near the courthouse. Neutral furniture, neutral walls, a long table that was designed to be nobody's territory. Thomas arrived with his attorney, a man named Preston Lyle, junior partner at a large firm downtown, who had the specific energy of someone who believed strongly in his own presence. Expensive suit, confident stride. He set his briefcase on the table with a sound that was meant to establish something. Thomas was wearing a tie I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago. I don't think he remembered that. Margaret sat beside me. Across from her, Robert Hawley, gray suit, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a folder in front of him that was 3 inches thick. Beside Robert, Diane Voss, expert financial analyst, 12 years of forensic accounting and expert testimony in 14 divorce proceedings, with the specific stillness of someone who has been in rooms like this many times and is never nervous. Thomas looked at Robert and Diane and then at me. A flicker of something, not quite alarm, not yet. Preston Lyle opened his folder. Given my client's recently acquired inheritance and the existing asset structure, we're seeking a distribution that reflects. Margaret slid a document across the table. Preston stopped talking. It was Robert's full report. 47 pages, tabbed and indexed, with every transfer documented. Amounts, dates, destination accounts, cross-referenced against marital financial records. LCH Investments, LLC was on page 4, with a footnote that identified the Cayman Islands account and the 3 transfers totaling $340,000. Preston looked at it. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Thomas picked up the document. He read the first page, then the second. Then he set it down and looked at me. Nora, the dissipation of marital assets is documented in full, Margaret said. Transfers initiated 14 months ago, 6 days after the estate was opened for probate. Our position is that Mr. Briggs anticipated and planned for this divorce well in advance of serving papers, and systematically moved marital funds offshore in anticipation. That's a significant claim, Preston said carefully. Diane, Margaret nodded. Diane Voss opened her own folder and walked through the numbers with the unhurried precision of someone who has done this in courtrooms and is not intimidated by conference rooms. She named every transfer. She connected every date. She explained in terms that required no legal training to understand exactly what the timeline showed and exactly what it meant. Preston leaned over and said something quietly to Thomas. Thomas shook his head. I'd also like to note, Margaret continued, that we have documentation of the inheritance's anticipated value during the marriage, and that certain estate assets may be subject to marital claim based on actions taken during the marriage to manage and maintain the relationship with the decedent. She paused. Specifically, the relationship between Mrs. Callahan Briggs and her father-in-law, which she maintained independently and consistently throughout the marriage. Thomas looked up sharply. What? Your father? I said quietly. His eyes stayed on me. I drove him to his appointments, I said, for 4 years. When you were traveling, which was often, I brought him groceries. I called him twice a week. I was there the night he fell and we had to take him to the emergency room, and you were in Phoenix, and I sat in that hospital for 6 hours. I was there. I held his gaze. He told me once that he didn't know what he'd do without me. He said it more than once. Thomas's jaw was very tight. We're not claiming the full inheritance, Margaret said. We're claiming equitable distribution of marital assets, compensation for the documented dissipation, and an adjustment that reflects 11 years of contributions, financial and otherwise, to this marriage. Preston Lyle was writing on a legal pad. He stopped writing and looked at Thomas. I'd like a moment with my client. Of course, Margaret said. They stepped outside. I sat back in my chair. My hands were in my lap, completely steady. Robert caught my eye across the table and gave a small, professional nod that communicated nothing, and somehow communicated everything. Margaret leaned close. You okay? Yes, I said. He's going to be angry. I know. He's going to say you ambushed him. I know that too. She looked at me for a moment. You did everything right. Preston and Thomas came back 10 minutes later. Thomas sat down. He looked at the table, not at me. The confident stride was still there. That kind of posture is muscle memory, but something behind it had gone quiet. My client would like to propose a settlement figure, Preston said. The number he named was significantly higher than what Thomas had originally intended to offer. It was not the number Margaret had prepared to accept. It took 3 more hours. At the end of those 3 hours, we had an agreement. The house, Thomas could keep the house because I didn't want it. Not anymore. Not that version of my life, but a clean, fair cash settlement that reflected the dissipation, the marital contributions, the 11 years. Enough to fund Read Forward's operating budget for 2 years and still leave me standing. Thomas signed the final page. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and looked at me across the table. You planned this, he said. You planned yours first. His mouth tightened. It didn't have to be this way. No, I agreed. It really didn't. Preston put a hand on his arm. Thomas shook it off. The same gesture exactly as the one I'd imagined in my head for months. The gesture of a man who has realized too late that the room has changed and he no longer knows the dimensions. He walked out. The door closed. The sound it made was very small and very final. There's an epilogue. There always is. 6 months later, Read Forward launched a new after-school program in 3 additional counties. We hired 4 new staff members. I stood at the ribbon cutting for our new downtown location, a real space, not a borrowed church basement, and shook hands and gave a small speech and meant every word of it. Thomas and Kara Sutton moved to Charleston. I know this because mutual acquaintances mention it occasionally, the way people do when they're testing whether you care. I don't particularly. I hope he's happy. I mean that without irony and without warmth, just the distant, clean neutrality of someone who has fully let go of a thing. Margaret Dyson sent me a bottle of wine when the settlement cleared. The note said, "You stayed calm when it mattered. That's why you won." I put the note on my refrigerator. I still still look at it sometimes. Robert Cawley's forensic report was eventually shared with the IRS. The offshore account turned out to have reporting implications that Preston Lyle's firm had apparently not fully considered. I didn't initiate that referral. Margaret made a call she was ethically required to make. What happened after was between Thomas and federal disclosure requirements. I don't lose sleep over it. The thing I think about most actually isn't Thomas. It's a Tuesday afternoon, about 8 weeks after the settlement, when I went back to the probate records to understand the full picture of Thomas's father's estate, out of professional curiosity, or something like it. Walter Briggs had written a note, not a legal document, just a note, handwritten on plain paper, found with the will and entered into the probate record as a personal statement. The attorney had read it at the estate proceedings, which Thomas had attended alone. Margaret got me a copy. Walter had written about the visits, the appointments, the groceries, the phone calls, 6 hours in an emergency room while his son was in Phoenix. Nora made me feel like I mattered to someone, he wrote, not because she had to, because she chose to. I want that acknowledged. He'd left a separate provision in the will, a small one, a personal bequest, specifically to me. Thomas's attorneys had quietly buried it in the probate complexity. It was one of the things Robert had found, not a fortune, $40,000, with a note that said, "For Nora's work. She knows the kind I mean." I sat with that document for a long time. Thomas had thrown away 11 years and a marriage and whatever good thing we might have salvaged, for money, and for a woman, and for the particular blindness of a man who looks at someone and sees only what they've always let him see. His father had looked at me and seen what I actually was. I donated half of the $40,000 to Red Forward's literacy fund in Walter Briggs's name. The other half I put toward a down payment on an apartment with big windows and a kitchen I chose myself. The morning I moved in, I made coffee and stood at the window and looked at the city. I'd built something real here. I still was.